Hi there, I'm John Hummelstad. I'm the CEO of Concept Safety Systems. I'm here today to talk to you about emergency procedures, about building and fire and emergency evacuation, as well as site induction and our product fire evacuation program. I want to talk to you about three things today. One of them is the problem that faces our community. The second one is the perceived solution to the problem. And the third one is how the future folds onto these problems and how we potentially do something with it. So the problem we all face, working in buildings, on sites, how do we make sure that our staff, our contractors, our visitors and volunteers on the site understand the site emergency procedures for a building, understand what to do when there's an emergency, and understand who the people are they go to when something occurs. That emergency doesn't have to be a building blowing up or a fire taking place. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a colleague having a heart attack. It could be an aggrieved client having words with your receptionist. There's policies and procedures in place, and there's reasons for those, primarily because people find it difficult to understand what to do when there's a panic. So our saying is feel safe and be safe, because we believe that's a key focus for people working in the work environments. So the Childers Backpacker fire occurred and 15 people died. If you have a look at that building, you can see it's a crumpled mess. There were no fire extinguishers in serviceable quality. There were no exit signs. There was no smoke alarms. This was being used as a boarding house. So the people that were in situ there, that had paid their money to stay there that night, died tragically as a result of no emergency plan in place, no education for the staff that were on duty, and indeed the poor people that were in there had stood no chance at all. An old building that burnt very, very quickly. Quakers Hill Nursing Home, a more recent event, 2011. 11 people died. Those people had trust in the nursing home that they were in. Their families had trust in that nursing home, and the procedures they had in place were found wanting. As a result of these two events, the problem that we talk about today got larger and larger. So what was the timeline to this problem? First and foremost, the coronial inquiry and the recommendations following the Childers Backpacker fire in 2008. The coronial inquiry brought about the Queensland Building Fire Safety Regulation, which at the time was seen as the strongest piece of legislative regulation in Australia, and it was seen at the forefront. And the reason that the coroner put forward the suggestion that the fire service play a more active part in regulatory work and inspecting of buildings was because they thought that the trust required that. The community needed to see trust back into how they managed things. And as a result, the Building Fire Safety Regulation came in 2008. It's very strong. It says if you own a building, you must, not you shall, you might, you must have an emergency plan in place. You must educate people in how to respond in a fire. You must have an organisational structure that can take command and control when a fire takes place, from a building emergency and fire takes place, from the point at which it's discovered through to the point at which the fire service turns up and responds. In addition to this, we have from 2002 onwards to 2010, in fact just recently another update to it, the Australian Standard for Planning for Emergencies and Facilities, Australian Standard 3745. And if you're in a healthcare facility, Australian Standard 4083, 2010. Both of these are standards, so they are the recommended best practice. In the absence of legislation, the best practice is what you use to determine the best course of action. So if an event occurs, one of the requirements for the law is to have a review and look at what would be the best practice. And that's why Australian Standards, in the absence of legislation, takes place and recommends. But in addition to that, in 2011, the harmonisation wave took across Australia that changed the way workplace health and safety was done. In New South Wales and Queensland, they very rapidly adopted the legislation, the suggested legislation, and it's followed since then in most states. What it recommends in Regulation 43 is an emergency plan for a facility where you employ people, where you're in charge of people, where you're the person conducting business or undertaking, takes charge and knows what must happen, so the PCBU. So there's momentum building around the responsibility of people that own buildings, that manage staff, that are responsible for sites. And that is that if you have people on site, you must look after them. You must give them the opportunity to be safe. So how do you do this? Well, following the 2008 Building Fire Safety Regulations in Queensland, Concept Safety Systems responded to a tender and won the tender to commercialise the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services software that trained people online in how to respond and how to respond and instruct for that regulatory framework. Since that period, we've had an incredibly good relationship with Queensland Fire and Rescue and Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, as they're now known, in which we describe and work with them on a better regime for the online training for emergencies. So the solution continued. We've got face-to-face training on the right-hand side and FEP, Fire Emergency Program, site-specific online product on the left-hand side. So on the right-hand side, if you could have a team of people doing your training face-to-face, this would be ideal. We all, as human beings, learn very, very effectively from each other. We learn in a tuition environment. It's effective and it's targeted. And it's also site-specific, because if I'm teaching you how to evacuate this building here, I know exactly the way out. I know where the extinguishers are. I know where the hose reels are. I know who the wardens are, who the chief warden is, where the fire indicator panel is. As I walk around, and this is my workplace, I know that. The problem is I'm not always available. And you must give, under the Building Fire Safety Regulation, you must give instruction within 2 days, or as soon as practical. Now, under Australian standards, slightly, it's about the same. But so site-specific, it is expensive because you need me here, or you need 2 of me. It has also limited availability, and it's high for non-attendance. The reality is that if we put 12 people around a board table and we say, you're now going to learn how to be a warden, and we're going to step through and teach you how to be the chief warden, we know that there won't be 12 full seats around that table. There'll be a million reasons why there'll only be 1 or 2. So that training then is necessitated, have to do that training again. So one of our major clients found that caused the biggest issue. They simply weren't achieving compliance. So on the right-hand side is the Fire Emergency Program, the site-specific online program. It's available 24/7. It's very targeted. It delivers the content relevant to that floor, that building, that site for emergency evacuation. It is site-specific. It's inexpensive, and it gives you an audit trail and very comprehensive reporting. So as a result of this, there's no excuse for not attending. You do it in your own time, you do it on your own device, or you can do it in a classroom style. So we know that face-to-face training is now perceived as pretty old school, and that present day and going forward, online training is the way in which most of us receive online tuition for almost every task now. So let me just step through the process, because the process is an important piece of this. In designing something that is truly site-specific, you have to gather the floor plans for that building first. You have to visit the site. You have to record the procedures. You have to have the equipment that's on site has to be put onto the floor plans in the specific spot that equipment is to be found. Because it's no good that if there's an emergency called or there's a fire noted, you run out of your office and that fire extinguisher is nowhere to be seen. And then there's a site audit that goes at the same time. So we actually go on site and make sure that the information that is there is correct and that the equipment is maintained and up to date. The second step of that is it's no good for you to do training unless you practice it. So a practice emergency evacuation drill is a requirement under the Australian standard. It's also a requirement under the Building Fire Safety Regulation. So that emergency advice is given by our specialists, wardens are trained, and there's scenarios practiced. So some of our larger clients want to have a scenario for a code black, which is an abuse. They might want to have a scenario for a medical emergency. They might have a scenario for a fire or an earthquake or a flood. And all of these things are simulated as part of that training because you have to deliver that. The final stage in this, of course, is that once the site-based training is done, then all of that content is brought back to the office where the actual floors are drafted, the information is enriched on the interactive plans, and emergency plan is finalised so that the client has received practical training, scenario-based training, and then step forward into the online world for the reinforcement of that information. So no two buildings are the same, so there's no way that you can have a generic system being placed in front of clients. It has to have a sense of purpose and site independence. So the solution for us is the Site Induction and Fire Emergency Program. 450 clients use this today across Australia, large clients, and it's particularly good for the compliance for regulation, laws and standards. And as you can see, it's available also on tablet, phone and PC. So this is a snapshot of a site. There's a packing hall there in the centre that's highlighted. Down the bottom is a whole bunch of logos and icons, vehicles, car parks, walkways, site assembly areas, smoking areas, firefighting equipment and safety equipment. All of these items can be commonly found in any work environment. So there's information that's enriched there for people to use. And on the actual floor plan itself, you can see here we've marked the egress path or the exit point from that office, following the green line out the exit, down the stairs and off you go. Now that is a static point, but of course is interactive and very intuitive to people that see that. To date, we've got over 50,000 floor plans for major corporates across Australia. Probably got one of the largest libraries of interactive floor plans anywhere in Australia, if not the world. We see the future as being really bright because we know that people are going to continue to work in offices. We know that people will continue to have the requirement to have spatial information around what they find in that office. We know that assets will continue to be a central point in most offices, whether those assets are the computers or they're the fire reference equipment or they're the booster or hydrant stations. Anything that requires that maintenance to take place can be placed on a floor plan, GPS marked, and any information associated with that can be added to it. Wearable technology, Google Glass. We work with Google at the moment on the Explorer program, looking for ways to take that spatial data and place it onto those floor plans so that you walk to a fire extinguisher. Glass recognises that extinguisher, says, John, this is a CO2 extinguisher. Do you want to mark it? So being able to place that and give it its datum point and broaden the information flow from that. We see the future as very bright for this because we believe that you can take that technology, whether it's glass or any one of a dozen types of wearable technology, and you could walk up into an emergency, you could walk up to the fire indicator panel. And if you were unfamiliar with how it worked, it could guide you straight through how that works. So in the time of an emergency, having that capacity to have a buddy system or a backup by using the technology. Of course, that's a fallback, but we see it as an incredibly important additional technology. The other thing we like very much about the technology is the immersive learning capacity of it. You know, today I can give you a lesson in CPR, but that lesson would not be anywhere as good as the lesson I could give you if you're wearing Google Glass and it stepped through the 10 principles for resuscitating a person. This is an incredibly powerful tool for delivering the exact right information in the right circumstance. The other piece is the internationalisation. Believe it or not, there's people in buildings, on floors, in healthcare facilities right around the world right now. We know for sure that all of those people need to be guided in the emergency procedures for the building they work in. They need to know who their warden or their marshals are that guide them in an emergency. In a hospital situation, that role would be a positional role, not an individual role. So we are growing the use of our programs across into the UK and the US. This is Alban Hospital, one of the larger hospital groups, part of a larger hospital group, the BMI group, across in the UK. And it's one of our first pilot programs into the UK. So other examples that are pretty important, public buildings, public transport, health industry, and manufacturing industry. I'll just step through very quickly on these. Public buildings. We find that the more employees that are employed by an entity, for instance, a large government department, there is a need to deliver a uniform training regime to those people so they understand what is expected of them. But the complication for that is, of course, you may have 40,000 people in that department. How do you deliver training to those people in their building, on their site, in their workplace that's consistent and is measured and delivers the same level of compliance for the organisation? You have to use a combination of methods, including online and face-to-face. The second one is public transport. Major airports, major transport companies, we find are among the best potential clients for us, and indeed clients for us, because they have a requirement not only to take care of the people that are employed by them, contracted to them, that are visiting their site, but members of the public. Members of the public are quite often using the services provided, and there is a moral and ethical and legal responsibility to ensure that they're safe in their passage. Health industry issues. Across the hospital groups, nursing home groups, we know, and healthcare facilities, we know that there's an enormous requirement to ensure that people that are under the care of people that are responsible for those entities are taken care of. That if there is an emergency that takes place, that those people, they're taken care of in the first instance, but also it's planned and measured, the response. Manufacturing. Across the manufacturing world, we see there's an enormous shift to quality programs. Concept Safety System is certified for 9001, which is the quality standard, 4803, which is the workplace health and safety standard, and 14001, which is the environmental standard. We see as this and the ideas around zero harm and safe workplaces continue to grow in momentum, there's a real requirement to have content and procedural content delivered to these environments. So that's one of the reasons why some of the largest manufacturers are also clients of Concept Safety Systems. Okay, thank you very much.